what is a text field in SwiftUI? So what I want to do is add the logic for this change value button, which will allow the user to change the main value for my app. And for this, I had a button and just an HStack and stuff, and this was all good for the UI, but for the logic, I'm going to be needing a text field. And so what a text field does is it allows you to get in some input from the user. And specifically for this text parameter, I'm binding a @state variable that I made at the top called main value variable, and this variable has to be of type string. And for the prompt, I'm just adding in the current main value. And so what we're doing by binding this variable is that when somebody clicks this text field, the keyboard is going to pop up. And then whatever value the user types in, that value is going to be assigned to the variable that we have binded in the text view. So without further ado, let's jump into the simulator, and you can see how this looks. We definitely need to add more formatting and things, but if the user clicks it, then we get this number pad. And the main issue with this number pad is that there's no submit button. So normally, like on the keyboard, there's a return at the bottom right corner, and once the user clicks that, the keyboard will go away. But here we manually need to add a save button so that the keyboard gets dismissed. And we're going to be jumping into how to do all that in the next reel. Happy coding! I want a text field in my SwiftUI app from which the user can only enter numbers. But the issue is that when I choose that type of keyboard, then there isn't any submit or return button. And so to fix this, the first thing I want to do is just lay out my requirements. And so I want a button that can save and close out of the text field. And that button should call vm.tabModelArray.changeMainValue so that the main value changes. And I also want to close keyboard. And so to do all this, I'm going to be using the focus state variable that we added earlier, and I actually have all the code planned out, and I'm just adding it in here, but don't worry because we're going to go over how it works in the next reel. Happy coding! Do you want this functionality in your SwiftUI app? So what I have here is a text field that takes in only a number input, and it uses the number keyboard, and it has a save button that allows the user to close out of the keyboard easily. And so what I have for this is an HStack, which contains a button that uses a tertiary operator to show either save or change value. And so I'm doing two things in this button. The first one is that I'm toggling the focus state variable. And what this is going to do is bring that text field into focus so that somebody can type something in. The second thing that I'm doing is using an if-let statement to check if what the user has typed in is a number. Because even though we only have a number keyboard, somebody could technically paste in something with letters, and that could just mess up our whole app. So we only want numbers here, and so if that's the case, then it's going to save this value and call the appropriate function. Besides that, I just have some formatting things, and I obviously have the text field at the end of the HStack. So if you're still a bit confused, just go ahead and pause the reel where you can see all the code and just go through it line by line. It's really not that complicated once you get the hang of it. Happy coding! Welcome back, guys, to building an entire app on Reels/Shorts. Today what I'm going to do is take the code that I had last time and just duplicate it 2 more times so that the user can change the central value, the increment value, and the name of the page that they're on in my app. And so this is really simple. I'm just changing out the variable names so that each piece of code works with the associated values. And the only thing I missed is that for the name, it's not going to be an integer value like the other two. And so I need to switch out the type of keyboard that I'm showing and also change some other small details. And even after I try to make those changes, I still forgot that I need to show a different type of keyboard that has all the letters for people to use. And so I'm going to be working on that in the next reel. Happy coding! Welcome back, guys, to part 98 of building an app entirely on Reels/Shorts. Today what I'm going to do is fix an error that I had last time where the keyboard type wasn't right for the name variable, and I'm also going to add a frame value to the background color circles, because if you noticed in the last reel they weren't really showing up, and that's because we haven't set an appropriate frame for them. And so if other elements get bigger, then they basically just disappear, which isn't correct. And so after trying all that out, I can see that my code is working for the change name, and I do think that those background circles need to be a tad smaller though, so I'm going to change that. And on the keyboard for the change name value, if somebody presses return, then the name is not saving. And we definitely need to change this, and we're going to go over how to do that with .onSubmit in the next reel. But one thing that I do want to say that overall our app is really coming together, and as you can see, the UI and the settings page and a lot of things are almost done. So we only have about, I would say, 15 to maybe 20 reels left before we're done with the coding part of our app, and then we're going to dive right into how we can actually submit our app to the Apple App Store. Happy coding! Do you want to see when the user presses the return key on a keyboard in SwiftUI? So the issue is that I've been using a button to save the value that a user has entered into my text field. And the reason that I've been doing this is because my other two keyboards are number keyboards and they don't even have a return key. But for the text keyboard, it does. And so what I want to do is add a .onSubmit modifier on my text field. And this basically just tells Xcode that whenever somebody presses the return key, execute the code inside of this modifier. So if I just add the appropriate function in my view model to this .onSubmit modifier, then my code is going to work as intended. Happy coding! How can we add the functionality to reset a value daily in SwiftUI? So this is probably the last complicated part of the settings page in my app, and there's a couple ways of doing this, and I tried to do some research on the best and easiest way to implement it in SwiftUI, and what I came up with is a method that uses user defaults, and you can't really use app storage specifically in this example, and I'm going to try to explain the logic as best I can. So the first thing I need to do is in my view model, I'm going to add a needs reset function, which is going to return a Boolean value, and this basically means that when the function is called, it's going to return either true or false. And besides that, I'm going to add a reset values function as well. Then in my home screen view, what I'm going to do is add a .onAppear on top of my entire tab view. And inside this is code that's basically going to execute every time somebody opens my app, or even if they have the app running in the background and they come back to it, the code should still execute. And so what I'm going to add inside of this is if vm.needsReset, then vm.resetValues. And basically, if you think about this conceptually, the needs reset basically just tells us if we need to reset the values or not, and the reset values function will reset those values. So it's really simple logic if both of those functions work properly. Happy coding! How can we loop over an array using the index values in SwiftUI? So what I'm trying to do here is check if each item in my tab model array has a value that needs to be reset or not. And so what I'm going to do is first add a let last index equal tab model array.count -1, because remember indexes start at 0. And then I'm going to add for I in 0 ... last index. And then I'm going to add the code that I want to execute inside. And so this code is going to execute for each index from 0 up until the last index. And for this code specifically, I have if tab model array and then using I for the index value dot reset is equal to true, then change the main value back to 0. And you can have whatever code you want inside of this block once you know how to use the loop. Just remember that I will be the index value and it'll go from 0, 1, 2, all the way up to that last index. One thing I want to address for my code specifically is the reason that I'm not saving my data here is because the change main value function already has save data called. And so I don't need to add that statement again at the end. Happy coding! How can I check if a day has passed since the last time a user opened my app in SwiftUI? So what I'm going to do for this may look a bit complicated at first, but I promise the logic is really simple. What I'm doing is using an if-let statement to get the last reset date that is stored in user defaults. And remember, user defaults is what app storage is built on. It's just that it has a different writing style and it uses this for key notation to specify which value we're talking about. After that, I'm going to have a calendar constant that is set to calendar.current to use our standard calendar. And then I'm going to set now as the date. And so date returns the exact date at that moment with time down to the seconds or even further. After that, I have start of today is equal to calendar.startofday for now. And so start of day returns the date that corresponds to the start of the day that we're in. So whether you call this at 12:01 a.m. or 12 p.m. or 3 p.m., it's going to return the same value until we change to the next day. Besides this, all I need to do is every time I do reset the value, I need to make sure that the start of the day that we're in is stored in that user defaults value so that it doesn't ever go out of sync. And I know that this can still seem a tad complicated, so I'm going to go over specific scenarios and how this code can handle them in the next reel. Happy coding! Welcome back, guys. In the last reel, we added the code to check if a new day has started since the last time a user opened our app. And so I'm going to run through why this code works in this reel. So the first thing to understand is that every time the user opens the app, we're going to be executing if needs reset, then reset the values. And so let's go over the different scenarios of why this code works. So the first scenario is the first time the user opens our app. There's no value stored in user defaults, and so the needs reset function is just going to return true. After that, because the user hasn't used the app app whatsoever. There is not going to be any pages that have our reset value as true. And so all we're going to do in the reset function is set the start of the day that we're on inside the last reset date. The second scenario is that the user opens the app the next day after turning the reset value on for some pages. In this case, our last reset date is not going to match up with the start of today, and so our function is going to return true. And we're going to go to the reset function and then reset the appropriate values through our loop, and then set the last reset date as the start of the new day. The third scenario is that the user opens the app on the same day again. And in this case, what's going to happen is that the value for the last reset date and the start of today are going to match up. And so our function of needs reset is going to return false, and we're not going to execute the reset function. So I hope that this helps clarify things a little bit more. And if you need to, rewatch the reel, and I'm sure that you'll be able to understand all of this code. Welcome back, guys. Today I'm going to be making one of the last logic components of my settings page, and that is the reset value button. Right now it's just some dummy code with no logic components, and so to fix this I'm going to be adding a dot on change of reset daily value in, and I'm going to be calling my function to change whether or not a value resets daily for a specific page. And I even added a print statement inside to make sure that this is working correctly. And as you can see, if we toggle the value to true, then the value actually changes to true and it'll call the function. And if we toggle it to false, it'll do the same thing for the false value. But there is still an error in this code that we're going to address in the next reel. Let me know in the comments if you know what it is. Happy coding! Welcome back, guys. In the last reel, I said that for a code to toggle whether or not a page resets every day at 12 a.m., there's still an error that we have to solve. And that error was that if somebody closes out of the sheet of the settings page, then the toggle shows up as false, even if the value was set to true. And so to fix this, all we have to do is add a dot on appear modifier and set the @state value, which always starts at false for reset daily, to the actual value using vm.tabModArray for our specific index.reset. And the reason that we can't do this in our init is because it says that we're trying to use self before everything is properly initialized, and that's a common error if you try to set the value of @state variables inside of the init using whatever you have in your view model. And so this is just a really simple way to make sure the value always reflects what it should be reflecting. And so with that, we're done for the code to reset our value at 12 a.m. daily. Happy coding! How can you add a button that allows somebody to rate your SwiftUI app? Today, that's what we're going to be covering, and before that, I just want to change the font of the delete this page button and all the smaller buttons at the end. And so the code to do this, though, is really simple. All we're doing is using if-let to get a URL value, and for that URL, you can see it on the screen, but the main part of this is your app ID in the middle, because we're going to have to replace this with the actual app ID of our app, which we're going to get through App Store Connect when we actually try to publish our app to the Apple App Store. And so don't worry, we will actually go over this because, again, this series is completely from start to finish, all the way to publishing on the Apple App Store. But right now, this is the best that we can do, and so I'm going to leave it like this and work on the Contact Us button in the next reel. Happy coding! How can I make a Contact Us button in SwiftUI that will open the default mail app in my user's phone and have my email address in the to section of a new draft? So to do this, all I have to do is first have my email in the form of a string and then use an if-let statement that does two things. The first thing is it'll make an email link, which basically just makes my email into a URL. And we can use that with uiapplication.shared.canOpenLink to make sure that that link can actually be opened, because otherwise we don't want to just go ahead and try and open it because we don't want any errors or crashes in our app. And so if both of those conditions are met, we will use uiapplication.shared.open with that specific link. One thing I did add here is an else if let statement, and this is just in case the user doesn't have the default mail app by Apple installed. And there are more complex workarounds so that we can support other mail apps as well, but since this is a simple app, I don't want to get into those, and instead what I would rather do is just open a URL to my app website, or just my website which has my email listed, so that those users can also find a way to contact me. Happy coding! How can we add an About Us button in SwiftUI? So the first thing that you should do is just make a constant with a type of URL that has the URL that you want to go to. And please make sure that this is a valid URL, otherwise this can lead to just strange problems that we don't want to get into. And so always just have a URL that works here. After that, all we have to do is add link, and then the string that we want the user to be able to click on, which for me is just about us, and then the destination. And for the destination, we're going to be using that link that we made at the top. And after that, our code will work as intended. And just to show you that this actually works, I just added Apple's default website here. And as you can see, when we click the link, it'll just open the default browser automatically, and then just go to whatever URL we have listed in our app. Happy coding! How can we add a drag gesture in SwiftUI? So I've decided that I want to add an additional functionality in my app, which is just that if the user swipes down, then the central value will decrement as much as it would have incremented if somebody would have tapped the screen. And so for this, the first thing I need to do is make a new function, which is really easy. It just has to change the plus equals to a minus equals. And then after that, I'm going to go in my tab view, which has all the screens for my app. I'm going to add a dot gesture. And inside this, I'm going to have a drag gesture, which .onEnded is going to use an if statement to check if the gesture was more than 100 in height. And so you can basically play around with this value. 100 is just what I found to be a decent amount for the user to swipe down, but also not get confused with tapping. And inside this, I can add whatever code I want. For example, the function that I just made. And with that, I'm also using a print statement to make sure everything is working. But as you can see now, if I swipe down, the value will decrease by the same amount that it would have increased if somebody would have just tapped the screen. So there's a lot more to do with drag gestures, and you can research that online, but this is just a really basic intro to how to use them. Happy coding! How can I add haptics inside of my SwiftUI app with just one line of code? So haptics are basically just that responsive feedback that you get when you touch something, like the home button, for example, on the SE models, or on some games where you tap and you feel like a little vibration in your finger. And so it's really easy to add. All you have to do is UI impact feedback generator, choose a style, and then add dot impact occurred. And so for the styles here, you can choose heavy, light, medium, rigid, and soft. And just this line of code inside any button will add that haptic feedback. Also, there's one other way that you can add haptics, and it's just a different style, basically using UI notification feedback generator, and then dot notification occurred, and then a specific type. And this is just to add a different type of haptic from the other ones that I had added. And obviously you can only test haptics if you have a real device and you simulate it in that device. You can't just test it on your Mac. And I will try to do this later, but also just the ones that I've added are ones that I think will align well with the buttons that I've chosen. Happy coding! Hey guys, and welcome back to building an entire app on Real/Shorts. We are really close to finishing all the coding components for our app. All I want to do is just format my settings page a little bit more. And so the first thing I'm going to do for that is add my entire VStack with all my components into a scroll view. And this will allow the user to be able to scroll through the settings page when they expand the help section. Also, I'm going to be changing the modifiers for the help section a little bit to make the text a little bit smaller. And I'm going to be adding links to a privacy policy and the terms of use in the same way that I had shown previously. And I do know that you need to have a privacy policy in terms of use if you have in-app purchases in your app. I don't know if you need to, if it's either a free app or just paid through the Apple App Store, but I'm still just going to be adding these in case so that my app doesn't get rejected in the App Store review. If you're worried about adding a privacy policy in terms of use, you can search up the requirements because they're often pretty simple, and you can use a free site like Wix or DirectMe or anything that you know to just be able to make a specific URL that you can add inside your app that will link to that privacy policy or terms of use. And with that, I think that my settings page is looking a lot better overall, and I may make some edits off camera just to refine it a bit, but it's not going to be any new concepts or any new coding, just to touch up everything and make sure that it looks good. Happy coding!